You had plans this weekend, and then they got canceled, and your first reaction, before you could stop it, was relief. Pure, quiet, genuine relief. You like people. You really do. You have friends you care about, conversations you enjoy, relationships that matter to you. But there is something about being alone, truly alone, no noise, no performance, no one to respond to, that feels less like isolation and more like coming home. And yet the world keeps sending you a message that you should want more social contact, that solitude is something to fix, that the person who genuinely loves being alone must be hiding something, healing something, or missing something they haven't yet found. But what if none of that is true? What if loving solitude isn't a symptom of anything? What if it's just who you are? And more importantly, where did that come from? Today we're exploring the psychology of people who love being alone, the neuroscience behind it, the childhood roots that shaped it, and why solitude, for certain people, is not the absence of connection but the fullest expression of it. Let's start with the biology, because the preference for solitude isn't a personality quirk that appeared out of nowhere. It has measurable neurological roots. Psychologist Hans Eysenck first proposed in the 1960s that introverts and extroverts differ not just in behavior but in baseline brain arousal. Extroverts have a lower baseline level of cortical arousal, meaning their brains are naturally running quieter, and they seek external stimulation, social interaction, noise, activity, to bring that arousal up to a comfortable level. Introverts, by contrast, have a higher baseline arousal. Their brains are already running at a higher internal frequency, and external stimulation, particularly the complex, unpredictable stimulation of social interaction, pushes that arousal past the comfortable threshold. It becomes too much. Not emotionally overwhelming necessarily, but neurologically costly. Solitude, for these individuals, isn't emptiness. It's the environment where the brain finally operates at the right level, where the noise comes down and the internal world, which is rich and active and genuinely absorbing, finally has enough quiet to be heard. This isn't shyness. Shyness is anxiety about social situations. Many people who love being alone are perfectly comfortable in social settings. They simply prefer not to be in them for extended periods. The distinction matters enormously, and the research is clear. Introversion is a neurological orientation, not a social fear. But neurology sets the stage. Childhood writes the script. Because not everyone with an introverted nervous system develops a genuine love of solitude. Some of them develop an anxious relationship with it. Some of them learn to fill every moment of alone time with noise, screens, and distraction because quiet feels unsafe rather than restorative. The difference often traces back to one question. What did being alone mean in your childhood? For some children, solitude was a gift, a bedroom that was theirs. Time to read, to imagine, to build things in their minds without interruption. Parents who respected their need for quiet. An environment where being alone wasn't treated as a problem to be solved, but as a valid way of being. These children grew up learning that their internal world was a safe and interesting place to inhabit. For others, solitude arrived differently, through loneliness rather than choice, through being the child who didn't quite fit with the group, through learning that the social world was unpredictable or exhausting or unkind, and that being alone was at least controllable. These children also learned to love solitude, but for more complex reasons. Their preference wasn't just neurological, it was also protective. Attachment researchers make an important distinction here. There is solitude chosen from a place of security, the person who is alone because they genuinely prefer it. And there is solitude chosen from a place of avoidance, the person who is alone because connection has felt too risky or too costly. Both can look identical from the outside. Both can even feel similar from the inside, but they have different psychological roots, and understanding which one is operating in you matters more than you might think. Here's what consistently surprises people who don't share this trait when they try to understand it. People who love being alone are not experiencing nothing. They are experiencing an enormous amount, just internally rather than externally. Psychologists who study what's called inner experience have found that highly introverted individuals tend to have what researchers describe as a more elaborate and active inner life, more complex internal narratives, more sustained self-reflection, a richer relationship with memory, imagination, and abstract thought. When a person who loves solitude sits quietly in a room with no external stimulation, they are not bored. They are thinking, processing, revisiting, creating. The internal landscape is genuinely engaging in a way that doesn't require external input to sustain itself. This is why solitude feels restorative for these individuals rather than depleting. It's not rest in the sense of doing nothing. It's a different kind of engagement, one that is self-directed, self-paced, and free from the energy cost of social performance. Because that's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. Social interaction, even enjoyable social interaction, requires a kind of performance. You are monitoring how you're coming across. You are reading the other person. You are adjusting, responding, adapting in real time. For people with highly active internal worlds, this performance runs on top of everything else that's already happening inside. And it is genuinely, measurably tiring. Solitude removes the performance, and what's left is not emptiness. It's the person, finally, without the costume. And yet, the world is not neutral about this. We live in cultures, particularly in the West, that are structurally biased toward extroversion. Open plan offices, group projects, networking events, the social pressure to have full weekends, full calendars, full social lives. The quiet but persistent message that a person who chooses to stay home, who declines the invitation, who genuinely prefers their own company, must be sad, or antisocial, or afraid. Author Susan Cain, in her landmark research on introversion, documented what she called the extrovert ideal, the cultural assumption that the ideal person is gregarious, comfortable in the spotlight, energized by social interaction, and always open to more. This ideal is so embedded in Western culture that introversion has been treated, at various points in psychological history, as something close to a disorder to be corrected. Children who love solitude are often told they need to come out of their shell. Adults who love solitude are often asked what's wrong. The preference for one's own company, in a world that organizes itself around the assumption of social appetite, reads as deficiency rather than difference. And that misreading has a psychological cost. Because when you spend enough years being told that the way you naturally are is insufficient, you start to believe it. You start to perform extroversion you don't feel. You start to apologize for needing to recharge alone. You start to experience your own solitude with a low-level guilt that has nothing to do with your actual needs and everything to do with a cultural script that was never written with you in mind. So let's be direct about what the research actually shows. People who love being alone tend to show higher levels of self-awareness. The practice of spending significant time with your own thoughts, without external distraction, builds an unusual familiarity with your own inner landscape. Your patterns, your values, your emotional responses, your genuine preferences, rather than performed ones. They tend to show stronger capacity for deep focus. The brain that is comfortable with silence is a brain that has developed the ability to sustain attention without constant novelty. In a world increasingly optimized for distraction, that capacity is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. They tend to form fewer but deeper relationships. Because people who love solitude are selective about where they invest their social energy, the connections they do choose tend to be chosen with more intentionality and maintained with more depth. Quality over quantity is not a consolation. It's a genuine preference that produces genuine results. And perhaps most importantly, people who love being alone tend to have a more stable relationship with themselves. They are less dependent on external validation to feel okay, less destabilized by the absence of social input, less likely to make decisions based on what other people need them to be. They have, in the truest sense, their own company, and they find it sufficient. The psychology of people who love being alone is ultimately the psychology of people who learned, early and deeply, that their internal world was worth inhabiting. That silence was not something to flee from but something to move toward. That being with themselves was not a last resort but a genuine first choice. It starts in the nervous system. It gets shaped by childhood. It gets misread by a world that confuses preference with pathology. But here's what it actually is. It is a different relationship with connection, not the absence of it. People who love solitude don't love people less. They experience connection differently, more selectively, more intensely when it happens, and with a clearer sense of who they are when they return to themselves afterward. Solitude, for these people, is not the opposite of connection. It is the place where they remember who they are clearly enough to connect authentically when they choose to. That is not something to fix. That is not something to apologize for. That is simply, honestly, who they are. And who they are is enough. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who finally needs to hear that their solitude makes sense. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you in the next one.